Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is an episode of Worldwise. You are Jonathan Kay, and you are in Canada. You are the opinion editor of the Canadian newspaper, the National Post. You're also a columnist there. And I think anybody who's been paying attention to the news lately knows what we're going to talk about. Twice within the last week, Canadian soldiers in Canada have been killed by Canadian Muslims in what seems to be, kind of what's commonly called homegrown lone wolf terrorism, although the evidence is still accumulating. Now, this is, I gather, been a quite traumatic experience for Canada.
It has been traumatic. Canada is not a country that is used to Islamist terrorism. Like all Western countries, we have some experience with terrorism. In the 1980s, there was an Air India plane that originated in Canada that was blown out of the sky in an episode of Sikh terrorism. We've had a few scattered incidents over the years. Several dozen Canadians were killed in Manhattan during 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
But these two victims this week are believed to be the first Canadian victims on Canadian soil killed by people who appear to have self-identified as Muslims and that we would describe as terrorists.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've heard is people saying this is the week that Canada changed forever. Is that being commonly said there in Canada? And if so, what do people mean? What do you expect to change permanently?
It is being commonly said. I take it with a grain of salt because it tends to be the kind of thing that pundits say in times of crisis. Um, it's sort of one of these things that, especially since 9/11, has just kind of rolled off the tongue when anything really bad happens.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's true. I mean, 9/11, of course, was an act of apocalyptic terrorism, and it truly did change the United States and Western society more generally. The London transit bombings really did change Britain and led to a raft of new legislation there, empowering the security state. Israel and Saudi Arabia have all had huge bombing events that have changed those societies. I don't think that what happened this week in Canada falls into that category because, unlike the precedents that I've just described, this does not appear to have been the work of a huge organized cell that is bubbling under the surface of Canadian society and which promises more larger attacks. And that was the case with 9/11. That was the case with the London transit bombings. In this case, both episodes were the work of recently radicalized, recently converted lone wolves, and both had an aspect of mental illness to them. If you look at their history, they were both in their mid-20s, around the time that a lot of schizophrenia victims first manifest symptoms. To a certain extent, they also appeared to be sort of suicide by cop, but with a terroristic aspect to them.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't Al Qaeda type operations. There was no sophistication to them. So, although people are treating it in the media in the first blush of terror following these incidents as, oh my God, this is what Canada changed, I'm a little suspicious of that. I think after the passage of a couple of months and years, we're going to look back and say those were both terrible, murderous events. But what they were isolated, one-man murders
Mm-hmm.
that were done under the superficial auspices of Islamist terror.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is the view that even lone wolf homegrown terrorism could become a significant problem under certain circumstances, right? And in this case, um, this happens to coincide with Canada's joining the alliance to the American alliance to fight something that is called the Islamic State, although that's misleading, I think some would say. But if you're a radical and, as you suggest, maybe unbalanced young Muslim to begin with, seeing Canada involved in an attack on something called the Islamic State, I mean, there is a concern that under circumstances like that, this homegrown lone wolf terrorism could become a significant threat. You don't seem to think so.
What I think is that every Western society has problems with mentally unbalanced, typically young men doing horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
You saw it at Fort Hood, although that was a much clearer example of what I would regard as a terroristic attack. About a decade ago, you saw a taxi driver, I think it was in either Los Angeles or Seattle. He drove to the El Al kiosk at the airport and he shot up the place, causing at least one fatality, if I remember. You had the Times Square incident in New York City. So this is a problem. But my sense is that in the cases of the two men who struck Canada this week, had this been maybe 30 or 40 years ago, these two men would have joined left-wing terrorist groups.
Right.
Or they would have joined a cult. Or if it was 100 years ago, they would have become anarchists. Sometimes in society, you do get mentally ill or violently disenfranchised men who will attach their violent disenfranchisement to whatever geopolitical theory is kind of out there that promises a structured, principled martyr's end in attacking their host society. And that is the function that militant Islam is now serving for some of these lone wolf types. That is the best explanation that I think I have.
Right. Now, is this discussion being had in Canada now? I mean, in America now, when something like this happens, it's pretty routine for arguments between left and right to form kind of right away, beginning with, do we call this terrorism or, whatever. But in Canada, is this kind of so novel that you haven't even gotten to processing it at the ideological level, or are there arguments breaking out about, what should have been done to prevent it? Should we be involved internationally in certain ways and so on?
There is a very matter-of-fact, healthy argument going on about what do we do when CSIS and the RCMP, who are sort of our equivalent of the FBI and CIA, when they discover that people are being radicalized. Because in at least one of the two cases this week, the killer was known to authorities. He was one of 90 men who were being closely watched, who were not being permitted to travel overseas because he wanted to join ISIS. So there's that matter-of-fact argument. There's also an argument about, hey, Canada has contributed about half a dozen CF-18 aircraft to the air war against ISIS. Was that a good idea? Are we drawing fire on ourselves? And that type of argument will be familiar to Americans or even Europeans. The same sort of argument happened a decade ago in Spain when you had the horrible bombings there, and it was largely the result of Spain going in on the Iraq War. However, it's fairly muted. Had this been 10 or 15 years ago in Canada, when Canadian foreign policy veered much more to the left, you would get all kinds of voices on the left screaming that this is backblast for us back in the United States, and this isn't so much terrorism as it is payback for our meddling in Middle Eastern affairs. And you are getting a little bit of that. Mm-hmm. There's a woman named Linda McQuaig, who's a well-known left-wing columnist, and she just wrote a column for a website called rabble.ca, which is along the lines that I just described. But in general, the mainstream politicians, the mainstream pundits are avoiding any kind of anti-Western, anti-American, blame the victim type rhetoric. And again, this is new in Canada. 10 or 15 years ago, you would have gotten a much more left-wing European-style debate. But Canada, under Stephen Harper, has become a much more conservative place, and it's now considered very politically risky to engage in that kind of rhetoric.
And has this woman who wrote for rabble.ca herself gotten a certain amount of blowback about questioning her patriotism and so on?
Yeah, but she's used to it. She's she's well known for that. She's kind of a Canadian equivalent of, say, a Noam Chomsky type figure. And we have other figures like, Naomi Klein is a well-known Canadian left-wing activist who usually can be counted on to write not apologism for terrorism. These authors are very careful not to excuse these actions.
Okay.
But usually by the third or fourth paragraph of what they've written, they usually contextualize it in, well, this is the consequence of joining in on the neo-colonial war against Middle Eastern nations.
Well, that's an interesting qualification you made, because, to say that they're not apologists, because you would characterize this as a kind of a blame the victim argument. And I'm wondering, do you think it is inherently the case that if you just say, my assessment of the causal background of this is that had Canada not signed on with the United States, this guy would not have committed this act of terrorism? Is that inherently a blame the victim argument to say that?
I think in a world of perfect rationality and logic, you could make that point and no one would jump on you. But especially when the bullet marks and the blood stains are still fresh, to make that argument is really a dangerous thing. And by the way, the United States saw that in the days and weeks after 9/11. I think it was Susan Sontag who made that argument in the New Yorker.
Yeah, she was not. She was not in the United States at the time. If she had been in New York, I think she would have like picked up on the vibe enough to realize she should wait a couple of days. But
yeah. But that's dynamic. That's you usually have to wait a couple of weeks to make that kind of argument,
right?
Because when the wounds are still fresh, people don't want to hear arguments. It doesn't matter what country you're in. People don't want to hear that argument when the wounds are still fresh.
Right. In the case of 9/11, that actually lasted a while. Of course, that was an event of quite some magnitude. I'm curious, did the Glenn Greenwald piece about Canada get much attention in Canada? Because that was I think it came out yesterday or the day before, and it was actually about the first of the killings. It was the guy
yes.
who ran over the soldier, and it made the point we're describing, not in especially diplomatic language, it's safe to say. Did that get attention in Canada?
It did get attention. There were some left-wingers who tweeted it around and said, oh, look, this famous guy is saying this. It kind of legitimizes a lot of the stuff we've been saying. I think a lot of other people tweeted around and said, oh, this Greenwald guy, he parades around as being the civil liberties fellow, but instead he's just a left-wing asshole who hates the West.
So do you think, it sounds like you think this is not going to become a big debate as to whether this is blowback for Canadian foreign policy that is more inclined to intervention than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago, right? That has moved to the right, that is more assertive. Do you think this is, we aren't going to see a wave of doubt about that drift of Canadian foreign policy?
Stephen Harper gave a speech yesterday. I'm speaking on Thursday, and I'm referring to the speech he gave Wednesday, in which he was very forthright. He said, we're not going to be intimidated. We're not going to be cowed. And by the way, I know national leaders always say that after terrorism.
They rarely say, we are going to be cowed, yes.
Yeah, we are going to alter our foreign policy based on this act of terrorism. They never actually say that. Sometimes they do it. In Harper's case, though, I would be utterly shocked if he would alter Canadian foreign policy in response to acts of terrorism. Say what you want about Harper, but he has a spine when it comes to this sort of thing, and he has gone all in by Canadian standards in the war on terror, hawkish rhetoric, Israel, pro-United States. He uses the language of defending Western civilization and all that stuff, old school type stuff, and it's notable, by the way, that before Harper even spoke to the Canadian public, he spoke on the phone with two people, Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu. This is where the guy's mind is at.
What is the Netanyahu connection? I mean, the American one seems a little more natural to me.
I tell people that Canada under Stephen Harper has become the most pro-Israel country in the world, including Israel. And Harper and Netanyahu, they're kind of both use each other for mutual photo ops. Canada's backing, sort of unquestioning backing of Israel has become a real campaign plank for the Conservatives. Support for Israel in Canada, as in the United States, is seen as a proxy for lots of other issues, for moral absolutism, for strong foreign policy, for being principled, for giving the middle finger to the United Nations, being tough on terrorism, being tough on militant Islam, being tough on the squishy academic left. So symbolically, I can see why Harper felt it was important to kind of have a bonding phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu. And by the way, Israel had its own horrible terrorist attack yesterday, too. There was a car that crashed into, I believe, a bus shelter, and a baby was killed. Mm-hmm. So that might have been, I'm presuming that was the subject of conversation.
And is this working for Harper politically? I mean, the whole platform you just outlined.
Yeah, it's working for his base. The Conservatives have about maybe 30% of the Canadian population solidly in hand. And for that 30% of the population, Israel acts as a super powerful proxy issue. Only 1 or 2% of the Canadian population is Jewish. Another relatively small portion is evangelical Christians, who also tend to be strong supporters of Israel, as they are in the United States. But there's this huge political conservative penumbra, we'll call it, that really does see support for Israel as a proxy issue for support for a dozen other things that they strongly believe in and that they vote on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you would certainly not expect Canada to change its mind about its involvement in the alliance that's fighting ISIS at a minimum.
Yeah, and by the way, when we say Canada's involvement in the alliance, Canada has a minuscule military. I think our contribution to the air campaign against ISIS is I think it's either 6 or 8 planes, and the planes are 30 years old. They're CF-18s that were bought when I was still a teenager. As your viewers can see, I'm very far from being a teenager. The avionics and weapon systems have been upgraded, but it is, in military terms, an extremely token contribution to the force. There are American aircraft carriers that have an order of magnitude more firepower than Canada's entire Air Force.
Although ISIS did put out some kind of video or something calling on Muslims around the world to attack specific nations, and mentioned both Canada because of its involvement in the alliance, and of course the United States and France and Australia and so on. So, and the first of these, as I'm sure you do know, the first of these guys, the guy who ran over the soldier earlier in the week, I gather that on his Facebook page or whatever, there isn't just militant Islam stuff. There's a lot of ISIS stuff, a lot of Islamic State stuff. So I don't think it's crazy to see a connection. I mean, I take your point. The actual involvement of Canada is minimal, but of course, if this is a strategy by ISIS to deter cooperation with the United States, doesn't really matter how minimal. In a certain sense, they're just trying to send a signal to countries. And of course, I'm not saying this was directed by ISIS, but ISIS put out a call for this kind of thing.
That's true. Although I think the best way to think of ISIS now is, in regard to being an inspiration for homegrown terror, it's similar to what Al Qaeda was maybe 5 years ago. It's a brand.
Right.
And if you self-identify as an Islamist lunatic who wants to go become a martyr and blow himself up, you will join ISIS Twitter feeds, you will watch ISIS indoctrination videos, you'll put ISIS banners on your Facebook page, and sometimes maybe even when you blow yourself up or engage in death by cop, you might even shout the name of ISIS as you're doing it. But it's very different from the 9/11 style of terrorism, where you had a central command structure and cells and well-trained terrorists who are responding to commands from people like Osama bin Laden. I think this is more of a branding thing that's done through social media and propaganda videos. To the broader point, does it have something to do with Canada's involvement in the Levant? It probably does, but I caution against drawing too strong a connection because, as I say, the men who go in for this sort of thing, 20 years ago they might have been survivalists, and they might have found some other banner to give some kind of...
I totally agree with that point, and and it's almost like when people say, well, was this terrorism or was this guy just unbalanced? Well, I would say much of what we commonly call terrorism is perpetrated by people who are some sense unbalanced, right? I mean, even if they're not raving lunatics, you don't, if everything's going fine and you got a family and, career's going great, you just don't generally become a suicide bomber. And so well, go ahead. It sounds like you want to respond to that.
I think what you just said is true of anomalous individuals who grow up in structured Western societies. I think, however, sometimes you do get entire societies that become given over to a terrorist ideology wholesale. That became true of northern Sri Lanka, for instance, in the 1980s and 1990s under the Tamil Tigers. It's become true of much of Lebanon, much of Gaza. It seems to have become true of the Sunni areas of Iraq and Syria. It is possible for entire societies to become pathologized in a way that terrorism, what we would regard as terrorism, becomes a sort of normal manner of political expression. But I don't think that's true of Western societies by any means. And I agree with you that when you get the examples like the two men in Canada this week, the boundary between terrorism and mental illness is a very blurry one, and they seem to have been motivated by a cocktail of the two.
Right, but my point wasn't. I mean, you're saying a whole nation can, or most of a nation can sympathize with what you're calling terrorist ideology. I'm talking about the people who actually do the suicide bombing, and I would argue that even within those societies, it's not your typical person who signs up. It's obviously a very small minority of people in any of these societies who choose to go on literal suicide missions. That remains a not common form of human behavior, happily. The sympathy thing, I think, well, this is in a way a different argument. But of course, from their point of view, they are, if you're saying a lot of Lebanon sympathizes with Hezbollah, which has launched missiles into Israel and killed, with the aim of killing innocent civilians, they're not seeing that as morally different from what Israel does to Gaza or what the United States did to Iraq or any number of other things, right? I mean,
I guess the specific example I'm thinking of in Lebanon, which it's not just the terrorists, it's the social support system for terrorists, is that you had a Lebanese terrorist who smashed in the head of an Israeli child with a rock several decades ago, and he was recently released back into Lebanese society, and he was treated as a hero. That's a pathologized society.
I guess I'd want to see how many people considered him a hero, but...
Oh, no, there were crowds. I mean, it was actually reported on Al Jazeera. I mean, he was...
Well, crowds. I mean, look, I've been to the grave of... Who was the guy who... the settler who went into the tomb of Abraham and...
Goldstein. Oh, no, but he's like there's freaks who
yeah, but I've been to his tomb. People still put flowers there. But years after the fact. Yeah. He's a hero among a certain brand of settlers. I mean, you could assemble crowds. I'm just saying you could assemble crowds who heroized the guy.
Okay, but Israel put this guy in jail, whereas Lebanon put this guy in parade. So there's the difference.
Sure. No, the way the government treats them is very different. But it's, anyway, I guess, my main point is, let's confine it to what you want to confine it to. This kind of, kind of homegrown terrorism. And we agree that, you'd have to, almost by definition, that you're likely to be unbalanced, as the term is commonly used. These are unbalanced people who would have clung to any available ideology under certain circumstances, any radical ideology that gave them a sense...
Sorry, if I can interrupt, this guy, I'm reading his name, Michael Zehaf Bibo. He's the guy who committed the killing yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just a classic example where he was so unstable that, he was thrown out of the mosque. I mean, the mosque wanted nothing to do with him, which I actually regard as good news in the sense that it's not as if he went to a mosque and people flocked around him. He was actually reduced to doing his proselytizing at a homeless shelter. And he was clearly crazy. I mean, his family had sort of lost touch with him. He'd resorted to petty crime. He was a drug addict. I mean, he's a classic example of the sort of completely marginalized, apparently mentally ill figure who you were talking about before. And I think it's important to raise these points because a lot of the hardcore conservatives in Canada, whenever something like this happens, the first thing they say is this is an example of the radicalization of the Muslim community in Canada. And I always point to the fact, I said, wait a sec, that would be accurate if this guy had this huge social and religious support system within a network of mosques in Canada. Absolutely the opposite. He was a member of no stable mosque congregation. To the extent he was thrown out. And I should also point out that the leading informants against terrorists in Canada tend to be people at mosques. Yeah. These guys join a mosque, they start to proselytize, and if they urge violence, there are people who come forward and talk about it. There was a plot called the Toronto 18 plot, I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago. And the reason that came to the RCMP's attention was because people in the mosque came forward and said this is happening. So anyone who says that this week's killings are an example of wholesale radicalization in Canada's Muslim community, I think it's very important to say, no, these are two individual guys. They got radicalized through the internet. The mainstream Muslim community in Canada, among the most peaceable of any Western country.
Right. So it's too soon for this discussion to probably happen in Canada, but I mean, if ISIS at the moment is an effective magnet for people who are unstable to begin with, is there anything that can be done to make it a less effective magnet. Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of a natural left-right argument over that, right?
That's broken down, and that's very interesting you say that. The left-right thing has broken down in Canada for this reason: that the Conservative government is sucking and blowing at the same time when it comes to ISIS. On one hand, they said, we are not going to let you board a plane from Canada if you want to go fight in Iraq and Syria for ISIS. We're going to take away your passport, and we're going to keep you confined to Canada. On the other hand, they also said that if you're a dual citizen who is suspected of being a terrorist, we are going to expel you to your other country. So let's say you're a dual Syrian-Canadian citizen, and the RCMP determines that you have terrorist sympathies. Canada would then forcibly throw you out of Canada, send you back to Syria. But at the same time, we have a policy saying that if you're going to join ISIS, we're not going to let you leave the country and take away your passport. And I have a colleague named Chris Sully. He's written a column for the National Post tomorrow. And he points out this glaring thing. And I don't think conservatives or liberals have figured out exactly what we do with these people. Because I know hawks who say, you know what, these people want to blow themselves up. Get them out of the country. I don't care if they blow themselves up in Damascus. Get them out of here.
Right.
So I don't know where that argument breaks down along conservative or liberal lines. I think it's very confused.
Yeah. I mean, the irony is glaring now because with at least one of these guys, he wanted to go to the Middle East, and you said, no, stay here. And he said, okay, I'll stay here. And then he killed a soldier.
He was on his way to Turkey, which is like the standard conduit point for people who want to go blow themselves up with ISIS. Yeah, and I mean, I think he might have even been literally hauled off an airplane. And it is kind of weird to say, oh, you want to be an Islamist martyr? No. We're going to keep you right here.
Yeah, stay here, right.
Yeah, and we're just starting to have this conversation about what we're going to do with it. And I don't think it breaks down along left-right lines. And I don't even think the Conservative government has figured out what it wants its policy on this.
I mean, the left-right argument I actually had in mind was, how do you make ISIS a less effective brand? And the typical argument is, on the right, it's kill them all, to slightly caricature the argument. And on the left, it's, if you declare war on them, that's feeding the propaganda machine that recruits these people. Yes,
that's true. What complicates things is when you have Iraq's own government saying, please help us, we're under attack. You have the Kurds, who seem to have the sympathy of most of the world community, left and right, saying, please help us, these people are bloodthirsty. And they're violently misogynistic. They're violently anti-pluralistic. It's an understatement. They enforce a modern-day version of slavery. They basically enslave women from any ethnic group they encounter. And so even if you're on the left, if you're a peacekeeper type and you're in favor of humanitarian intervention, sort of sub-Saharan African type humanitarian interventions, there's a strong, strictly humanitarian case for intervening militarily against ISIS.
Oh yeah, there always is with these things. I mean, and that's what in the U.S., that's what kind of divides the left. Yeah. There's kind of left-wing realists and left-wing kind of more human rights-oriented, and that they disagreed on Iraq and so on. And I think that's why the balance tends to favor intervention. The left is divided between interventionists and realists. The right traditionally has not been, although now you're seeing a resurgence of, the Rand Paul.
It's more muddled now. It's more muddled because I think you're right that there was some dissent back in 2003 with Iraq. But if in 2003 in Iraq, if you were a leftist in the United States who supported the Iraq invasion, you were kind of an outlier. Like, it was kind of weird. You could make a principle.
No, actually, it wasn't. In the U.S.?
In Canada, certainly. Yeah.
What's that?
In Canada, certainly, if you were...
No, in the U.S., it depends on what you mean by leftist. But if you mean left of center, most of them supported the war. I was in a minority. I opposed it. Very few American pundits, writers, and so on, out and out opposed the war in advance in writing.
Okay.
Now you can define leftist narrowly enough so that you're right, but that's a pretty narrow definition.
I know that a majority of newspaper editorials supported the Iraq War in 2003.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And columnists. What was I? So anyway, that is the kind of left-right. There is that argument. Does fighting them, in effect, make them stronger as propagandists, as a magnet for disaffected people, especially when you make it almost a declaration of war, the way Obama did, for reasons that still kind of escape me. But you're not. Sounds like you're not yet having that argument, and you may not.
I think most Canadians realize here that that Harper's commitment is sort of a token one. I don't think militarily it's a token one. Symbolically, I think it's a very important one. And I don't think anyone in Canada believes politically that anything is going to change until the Harper government leaves. Now, there's an election scheduled for a year from now in Canada, 2015. And interestingly enough, the major opposition threat to Stephen Harper, which is Justin Trudeau's Liberals. Trudeau, although it's sort of it's a middle of the road party, he created controversy when he came out a couple of weeks ago against the bombing of ISIS. And that was sort of a surprising move because, as you say, there are a lot of left-wingers, middle-of-the-road types who support the bombing along human rights grounds. That, to my mind, signals that if Trudeau's Liberals are elected to form a government in 2015, you are, after a decade of conservative, hawkish foreign policy, you are going to see a swing to the left in Canadian foreign policy.
You know, on your point about how easy it is to hate ISIS, I almost thought they were trying to. I almost thought that was a strategy. I mean, the beheading videos. I almost wondered, were they an attempt to draw the United States into it? You know, but I guess it's funny, we have not seen that much of that kind of propaganda lately, right? Initially, they were doing a lot of that, but they're not now. So I don't know what exactly their game is. I think
the stage for all this was set in 1979, when the Islamist revolution really took root in Iran. And Iran, one brilliant propaganda thing they did is the Ayatollah said, the United States is the great Satan. And they branded their revolution as not just an Islamic revolution, but it was also a revolution against everything the United States stood for. You know, profligate, commercialism, capitalism, decadence, libertine, sexual values. And since 1979, that was 35 years ago, any major revolutionary Islamic movement has always found it important not just to posture against the United States, the great Satan, as well as Israel, the little Satan, but to try and establish themselves as the definitive medium for opposing the pernicious influence, as they regard it, of the United States, of democracy, of capitalism, of godlessness, of secularism. And I think ISIS very much is following in that mold of saying, you know, to prove ourselves worthy of being a caliphate, right, in the modern political currency, we have to show that we are the definitive anti-American brand. And so it's not just killing a bunch of Arabs in the middle of the desert. It has to be about creating an existential threat, or at least a perceived existential threat, to the great Satan, which is the United States.
Right. Although that only became a huge talking point, if I recall correctly, after we bombed, right? I mean, both of those videos came after the United States started bombing, right? And before that, that was not nearly... Maybe I'm wrong.
My memory is it predated the bombing.
Both videos predated any bombing at all?
I believe it predated the bombing campaign.
It predated Obama's speech for sure. I was thinking we did an ad hoc bombing to save that dam before, but maybe this is checkable. We'll figure it out. Finally, though, let's just talk a little more about Canada. You said you don't buy the idea that it's going to be utterly transformative and things will never be the same. Will there be a little more security? I mean, I gather that this guy didn't have as much trouble running into the parliamentary building as a guy would probably have running into Congress in D.C. Were there even guys with guns who were?
Yeah,
there were.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you asked that question. There were guys with guns. I lived in Washington. I've been to Ottawa, and it is much easier to gain access to Parliament. Basically, you walk in, and there's sort of a vestibule area, and if you're a visitor or a journalist, you have to go through an airport security style check. What this guy did is he showed up at the doors of Parliament, and he kind of essentially busted through the velvet rope and said, "I'm not going through the check. I've got a gun," and that's when the bullets started flying. So What will probably happen now is they're going to restructure the entrance to Parliament. So it's not just a velvet rope, it's an actual hard partition that you have to go through a gauntlet of armed security agents. Now, as this incident shows, those armed security agents are there. They're the ones who shot him dead. But the security protocols on Parliament Hill are going to be obviously a little stricter now. I wrote a column that appeared in today's National Post where I said, you should not change the fundamentally open character of Parliament Hill. The great thing about Parliament Hill is you go there, you're on the grass within a stone's throw of the Parliament buildings. There are guards there, yes, but you can see the changing of the guards. There's a huge sound and light show that takes place at night. It's basically Canada's public square, and it's a beautiful place. And you really do feel enclosed by the parliamentary buildings. I took my kids there. It sort of gave life to all the civics lessons they learned in class. And one thing that I wrote in my column is I said, I hope this one lone evil idiot does not catalyze the erection of walls everywhere so that you can really only see our parliament buildings from a couple hundred yards away, which is more or less how the White House works, right?
And how the international transportation system works. I mean, 9/11 succeeded in inflicting a huge actual cost in terms of money on, Americans and people around the world. Just how much more it costs to travel. How much,
Yeah. And it's created an army of bored, disaffected, poorly paid security agents at airports, and basically soured the civic experience of intercity travel for hundreds of millions of Americans.
No, quite so. Now, you said that the security guards are the ones who shot him dead. I thought the sergeant-at-arms shot him dead. Is that...
Yeah, the sergeant-at-arms is actually interesting, and this is something I only learned after this incident. The RCMP has security jurisdiction on Parliament Hill, but once you actually enter the building, the security jurisdiction is under the authority of the Speaker of the House, which is bizarre. It's basically a political figure. It's sort of a deprofessionalized system where a political figure is actually the commander of the security force. I think what happened in this situation is as soon as the shooting started, you had guys coming in from all sides, including from out of the building, to assist in taking him down. So I think there was no shortage of guys with guns who came running in as soon as things got hot and heavy. But one of the effects of this attack will be that it's going to professionalize and probably integrate the security system around Parliament Hill, because I think there's something like 3 or 4 different security structures that now exist within a couple of hundred square yards in that building.
Well, one reason I ask about the security is that I read that the sergeant of arms killed him, and I said, wait a second. If the actual sergeant at arms is the guy who has to kill the guy, we need more work around the perimeter, right? But I gather there actually was a certain amount of security around the perimeter, and maybe it's more ambiguous than I had heard as to who actually fired the lethal shots.
The first reports were that the sergeant of arms did it, and everyone wanted to believe this because he's this nice guy, he's a 58-year-old guy, and he usually carries a ceremonial mace.
Right.
So he's sort of a figure out of Victorian times, and people like the idea that he was hiding a gun in his mace or something like that. It made for sort of a good James Bond thing. And in fact, he may have been the one who shot the guy, but the guy died essentially in a hail of bullets. I think at this point, no one's quite sure which security guard killed him, but certainly this guy Kevin Vickers, who was the sergeant at arms, which is such a great name for a job description. I love it. He's been lionized, and there was a special ceremony in Parliament today.
He got a standing ovation I saw in the House of Commons.
Yeah, and it's a nice... You know what? After these things happen, countries need heroes.
Right.
This is one of the reasons that sort of the firefighters became cult heroes in New York after 9/11 is there's sort of this primal hunger for hero figures. And in this case, he's a genuinely nice guy. And if you look at the video, because there was a reporter captured the shootout using a cell phone video, so it's actually quite shocking. In American terms, it's the equivalent of shootouts happening in Congress or the Senate building or something like that. You can see all of the security staff actually rushing towards the gunfire, doing exactly what they were trained to do, doing exactly the opposite of what I would do, which is run away screaming. And so when I saw that, I was, people say, "Oh, this is horrifying." Yeah, it's horrifying because we hate violence. But I was actually inspired that these guys who've probably spent the last 20 years of their life pretty bored,
Yeah.
answering tourist questions about where the bathroom is. Suddenly, actual real gunfire breaks out. They do their job. They rush to danger. They take the bad guy down. I actually thought that was a good news story.
Yeah, and it's impressive that nobody got shot whom they didn't plan to shoot, so far as I know. Certainly nobody got killed.
Well, the narrative, what happened was, there was, tragically, the guy, repeat his name, Michael Zahav Bibo, the murderer, the terrorist, however you want to describe him.
Right.
He shot an unarmed Canadian soldier who was guarding a monument.
Right. Oh, right.
Way. So, and he shot him dead, and he then rushed towards the Parliament. And once he got to the Parliament, things turned around the other way. He could have killed dozens more people. But it was in Parliament that he failed to kill anybody.
Right.
I think he shot an officer in the leg or something like that. It was a superficial wound, as I understand. And then he was shot. But it could have ended, it could have been horrible. It could have been a huge body count.
Oh, sure. And not just because of what he did, but because typically in situations like this, the crossfire, there's a lot of friendly fire incidents are common. And that's one thing I was remarking on. It's impressive that nobody hit the wrong guy.
Yeah. It was that part of the operation I think Canadians were very inspired by.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, thanks for taking the time. I know you've got a lot to do. And I hope next time we talk, it will be under happier circumstances.
Well, next week we're having our mayoral election here in Toronto, and hopefully Rob Ford will be out of office. So the next time we talk,
that's a happy circumstance right there.
The next time we talk, Toronto hopefully will have a new mayor. So
okay. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Okay. See you, John.